My teacher had an interesting statement towards the end of his life. He was being interviewed by a filmmaker. She was sort of struggling to broach the silence gap that Roshi was manifesting because he was old. I mean, he was like 106, 107, and he was tired, and he was constipated, and he didn't want to sit there in front of cameras, bright lights, a microphone, and a filmmaker and have to yak. So she kind of stumbled and stopped at one point and looked at him and said, you know, you're 107 years old. You've been in a Zen Buddhist context, training or teaching full-time since you were 14 years old. When you reflect back on your life right now, tell me what comes up for you. And I remember he looked at her, kind of came out of, let's call it a meditative reverie, and looked at her and he said, I have made many mistakes in my lifetime, but the greatest mistake was teaching. What Roshi meant is that ultimately Zen can't be taught. And yet here we are, sitting in front of a strange orange curtain that looks like it came off the set of a 1990s Twin Peaks episode. David Lynch, David Lynch, David Lynch, weirdness. If you're lucky, at the end of this video, I'll throw the curtain and reveal what's behind it. Here we are, in front of the orange curtain, talking about, if not teaching, at least talking about Zen. Why? If you can't be taught, why bother? So the reason this comes up is because I had an experience recently of being really energized on the meditation cushion. And I would go so far as to say it was like deep sitting, deeper and less distracted than a lot of my sitting has been in the past. And I wanted to communicate sort of what that sitting was like and how I got there. So I shot a video. And of course it was all sorts of messy and wrong, and many of you, or a few of you, one person I talked to directly told me my head was up my ass, and then somebody on Patreon texted me and in so many words said, your head's up your ass. David Lynch weirdness. Sorry about that. So what I want to do is, in the simplest terms humanly possible, I want to share with you the gift that Zen Buddhism has been for me and why. So how it's been helpful, how it's been useful, how it works. That's what I want to try and share with you. And I think that's what I was trying to get at last week. So I'm going to put this in simplest, clearest terms possible. Here we go. So Rinzai Zen is Buddhist. Buddhism, ultimately, if you had to reduce the entire tradition to one single solitary point, what would it be? End suffering. That's the point of Buddhism. So suffering is different than pain. I stubbed my toe, that's pain. I stubbed my toe and, what the hell is this chair doing here? Who left this goddamn chair in my way? That's suffering. We are convinced through some kind of mysterious psychological voodoo that we have permanent, fixed, solid selves. So how does Rinzai Zen Buddhism teach us to deal with suffering? First of all, it shows how the self appears or arises. So the way my teacher talked about it was, and I'm going to put this really simply, there's the outside world, okay? The world outside, and then there's the inside world. The two come together. They meet. There's a connection or a kind of friction there. This happens over and over and over, right? The outside world is coming through all of my senses. It's coming inside me. It's impregnating me. And instantly there's a new baby that's born inside of me. And that baby is the I am of that moment, right? I mean, think about it. You're walking down the street, you hear an explosion from the outside world. The baby is born inside of you of, oh my God, what the hell was that? The outside world connects with your inside world and a new self is born. That self grows up, that self matures, that self dies. This happens over and over and over, moment after moment after moment. So you can see that the self is actually not a noun, it's a verb. It's not a thing, it's better thought of as a process. Because in some sense it means I'm free. I'm free of a fixed, permanent, solid, big, fat, ugly, demanding, aggressive ego inside of me. Rather, I'm free. In each new moment, the activity of the Dharma gives rise to a new self, and then that self dissolves, and another self arises, dissolves, arises, dissolves. So the thing that I like about Rinzai Zen Buddhism is that it's proactive, and it's practical, and it uses really simple principles that you can put into practice in order to manifest the whole end of suffering, which is the point of Buddhism. So how does it work? It's so simple. You give yourself completely to whatever activity you're doing. This way, inside and outside come together. So Roshi would talk about how you have that child that's born from inside and outside interpenetrating and connecting. That child of self is born, and then your job is to give that child away. The child gives back to the outside world, gives back to the inside world, right? You give it away. So when you do an activity completely, there's no separation between inside and outside. That self that stands as the dividing line dissolves, and inside and outside become one. It's such a simple teaching, but that's what's so great about it. You can do it over and over and over. And in that sense, you have a North Star for your soul, for your human heart, for your life. You have a path. You can turn all the trials and tribulations and disappointments and conflicts of your life into practice, because every time the suffering self arises, you know what to do, right? You sit back if you're at a party and you just asked a guy out and the guy said, I would never date you. You're a disgusting woman. And he walks away. There is an eruption of suffering inside of you. You know what to do now. Place your feet on the ground. Take a deep breath over and over and dissolve that suffering self by giving yourself to your surroundings completely, right? And maybe there's a blink where the self disappears, and then instantly the pain rushes back. And then suffering follows, and then you give that suffering self away again. You're just forgetting the self, throwing the self away. Sometimes it's called killing the self. I find that expression to be a bit too violent, but no matter what happens, there's this leaping over the wall of self, right? Beyond self. So, bringing us back to last week's video, I talked about how more and more I'm starting to realize that for me, really good sitting is when I completely give myself to the just sitting, right? And that's when my sitting is at its strongest, and that's when my sitting is at its clearest, when I don't let myself get distracted by thinking, feeling, daydreaming, drifting, scattered mind, but when I'm able to completely die into the next breath. What I think happens is when you give yourself away completely on the cushion like that to your breath practice, the self dissolves. And then this new self arises, right? And a lot of the time, this new self just drifts. Like I noticed that the other day. I went to the cushion and I was really anxious and I was really kind of caught up in my problems, right? And they were very strong and very familiar. And then I sat down, and the first thing that happened was I realized the problems. And I was like looking in a mirror, an emotional mirror, right? It was like, yikes. And then I was able to hold the problems in my sitting and to do my breath practice and to hold them in the context of the sitting and to do the breath practice and to hold the problem in the context of sitting and to do the breath practice. And then you can see the problems start to become a little bit porous and breath starts pouring through them. And then pretty soon the problems become thinner and thinner and more porous, and then they're like gone. And that's when you die. And then this self was reborn, yeah? And it was probably 5 minutes later because my mind drifted. Once it finally breathed apart the problem, my mind, I think it just drifted. It was so happy. And I wasn't conscious, and I wasn't doing my tough, straightforward, good Rinzai Zen practice, right? I perhaps had breathed apart the emotional state, the attachment to a self, to my suffering, right? And I was drifting all over the place, but it was no problem, right? And then eventually I became conscious or self-conscious that I was thinking. And the thought I was having was, man, I'm gonna die someday and be gone, and all these problems that I came to my cushion with today, they ultimately don't really matter. There's such a greater context that these problems are taking place in. So don't worry about it, right? That's a beautiful thought. That mind that wandered into that thought somehow, like, is beautiful, Zazen. And you know what? Maybe the suffering mind that I had to breathe into is also beautiful. We bring that to the cushion, no problem. My only point is this. Rinzai Zen shows you how to focus your mind and tells you to focus your mind and gives you a practice to do that and tells you that's important because it's giving you something to do, right? Like if you're suffering and you're in a bad space and you want to get out of it, I've found that it's just not helpful to try and have an insight or to return to a mantra that's going to rescue me from this, or to say a prayer to Jesus to deliver me from it, or to smoke a cigarette, smoke a joint, take a drink. None of these things really help. Rather, the principle of giving myself completely to something, and it could be any one of those things I just mentioned if I give myself completely to it, except perhaps drinking and smoking, because that's just going to be trouble. But for example, giving myself to a mantra, or giving myself to a prayer, or giving myself to the breath, or if I'm in the kitchen, giving myself to chopping carrots or pulling the pop top off of a can, right? Giving myself completely to any activity that allows that thinking, suffering self to dissolve. And like I talked about with breathing and Zazen, that self becomes kind of porous, dissolves, I become one with the world again, I die into the activity, and then a new self is born. So the reason Zen works for me, Rinzai Zen, is because it's proactive, okay? But whatever you bring to the cushion and whatever happens on the cushion, I think is Zazen and is okay, all right? For me, it's been helpful recently to try and focus my mind and do my breath practice and my sitting practice completely so that I can have that dissolution of the self and have those moments of resurrection happen, as opposed to just kind of mucking around in the thinking mind. If you want to be a part of this and you want to support what's going on here, the link for Patreon is below, and it's also in the description, as well as PayPal. I really appreciate your help. I offer all these things for free, but I'm trying to make a living off of this now. So if any way you can help, if you want to support, please do so. Whew. Oh, I promised you that I would show you what's behind the curtain.